Hello, I'm Shilpa Vijaykrishnan and I head the education and outreach programming at MAP. I'd like to wish you all a very warm welcome on behalf of the Museum of Art and Photography for today's talk, A Tree Grows in a Painting, organized as part of the programming around MAP's online exhibition, Bhuri Bai, My Life as an Artist. We are very pleased to have with us present this talk today, the fantastic Dr. Annapurna Garimella, a woman who wears many hats. She is a designer and an art historian whose research focuses on late medieval Indic architecture and the history and practices of vernacular visual and built cultures in India post-independence. A more comprehensive biography of her can be found in the chat box. Today, we are very excited to have her present on Gonds Pardhan representations of the world around them, looking at the questions that their art raises about the relationship of humans and the non-human, specifically through the stories and paintings which mediate Adivasi relationships with the non-human. Please free to send in your questions for Annapurna using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take them at the end of the session. Last but not least, I'd also like to introduce our sign language interpreter for the session today, Atul Kumar. And now the floor, so to speak, is all yours, Annapurna.
Thank you so much. I'm just putting myself on video for a few minutes, and then I will turn myself. And then I will turn the video off because I am operating on a hotspot at my mother's house in Hyderabad. So if you have any problems hearing me, you're welcome to please put it in the Q&A or in the chat, and I will go back and repeat. This has worked very well. So I want to begin by first of all thanking a few people, because nothing ever happens just all by yourself, right? So I want to begin by thanking Shilpa Vijaykrishnan, Shruti Rao, Priscilla Roxburgh, and Atul Kumar for working with me, the MAP team, for working with me to do this presentation. I also want to thank a lot of other people, because the paper that I'm presenting to you today would not have been possible without a chain of relationships from, let's say, 2007-ish onwards, from Vidya Shivdas, who's now head of FICA, to Devi Art Foundation's Anupam and Lekha Podar, to Dr. Jatinder Jain, so important, and to many, many artists, including Bhuri Bai, and also Baju Sham, and many, many others. The paper that I'm presenting to you today, it is a paper because I'm going to read to you. It's the first time I've ever done something with sign language interpretation simultaneously, and I'm not sure about the stability of this connection. So I'd rather read, but it won't be too like onerous. I think I've tried to make it quite light, but I'll keep interrupting as I have a tendency to do, interrupting myself and also talk with the images. So I also want to thank Ravi Agarwal and Latika Gupta and the Goethe Institute, which first invited me to a conference, and then Ravi did an issue of Marg from which this paper was published. And therefore I want to acknowledge these are issues that I've been thinking for a long time, but you always need somebody to say, will you sit down and take your research and thinking and write something for us? And then you feel like there's a purpose to something. So I'm going to put my video off now, and I'm going to share my screen, and we'll start. Thank you, all the participants for coming today. I know this is at 6 p.m. in the evening, and it's a Saturday, so that you would choose to come and spend time with listening to me. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you so much. My screen. So let me just go back to the very beginning so you know me. And let me reduce my things. Okay, so this, as you all know. So where does this work come out of that I've been doing? It's kind of old, like my work is on this material has been going on for at least now 11, 12, no, about 14 years maybe. Yeah, 14 years. And it has had moments where it's condensed, and those moments of condensation have really challenged me to think a little bit about who I'm making this work for, what I'm doing with it. So I have this commitment to creating an art historical conversation, a critical discourse around vernacular art forms. Vernacular is not a great word. I'm happy just for someone else to come along and challenge that word and change it. I'm really happy for that. But it's a word I have used because it's a problematic word. It's not a safe word. It has a difficult history. It's beginning to be used more widely in contemporary art. For example, there was a recent Biennale or Triennale in Australia where they found this idea of vernacular in the contemporary, which I coined maybe 10 years ago, as a useful way for them to think about indigenous art of today, indigenous peoples, indigenous artists of today and their art as contemporary. So I was commissioned by Lekha and Anupam Poddar for the Devi Art Foundation to do a large exhibition, and they were very generous. And there were many artists and many researchers and photographers and people involved. And what I said at that time, after doing about a year or 2 years of research, that we could not do folk and tribal art, but we would in fact have to do a range of art forms based on their collection, because they had contemporary miniature painting, they had a lot of different kinds of art forms that we would call vernacular, because these things were often in a collaborative or maybe in a parallel relationship with Anglophone or art that speaks in an English language to some extent. Though that's what you used to see, at least in those years, primarily in art galleries. And so in a decade is a long time in India these days. And then I wanted to say that these art forms are also contemporary, all of these art forms. The artists are negotiating lots of questions. About 60% of the art came from new commissions based on the interests of the artists. It was a kind of like an art school that we ran. And about 40% of the exhibition, which ran over 2 parts, over 2 years almost, yeah. These 2 parts, about 40% of the artwork in these 2 parts was from their already existing collection. So this is Lekha Poddar, and let me just go to the next slide. And this is, of course, me. So you can see that there's a kind of a glorification of this project, which I kind of was really uncomfortable with, because you know, when you do something new anyway, when I do something new, it's new, but I don't know if it's wonderful. It's new, it's wonderful because I get to do something new, but I don't know if it's wonderful for the world. It's something that I would be hard pressed to say that everything one does in this world is going to be eventually wonderful for everybody, because the world is a dynamic thing. And our work is so dynamic, and no one can control what happens to the work once it starts living in the world, independent of the thoughts that you have when you bring to it. So, you know, folklore for the future and all these sort of things, you know, it's just a very different, that was when I used to color my hair, and I don't anymore, so that's a different era. And I've also then hop, skip, and jumped to 2018 to this exhibition, which happened at the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art. And this is the Jangar Singh Sham exhibition, a conjurer's archive. And this exhibition is primarily based on the collection held by MAP. So I want to acknowledge that, because it is our host of this talk today. And thank you very much, MAP, for sharing your work across with other institutions and allowing people in different parts of the country and the world to see this. So when I was watching this exhibition, because it was such a huge and gorgeous exhibition, I was watching not only the paintings, but I was watching people watching the paintings, watching people discuss the paintings, paintings, listening to them. And there was, of course, great beauty. I love Jangar's work. I love the artists who he grew into his fellow artists, his colleagues, many of them family members. But I was also fascinated by the fact that most people just were so interested in seeing this as cute, as traditional, as tribal, but we're finding it a little bit difficult to understand it as contemporary, or if they understood some parts of it as contemporary, that challenged their idea about what a tribal artist should be doing. So these are the kinds of things that were have been going through my mind. Simultaneously, I've been watching the publication world and these beautiful publications that Tara Books makes. For example, this gorgeous book called The Nightlife of Trees, which are really gorgeous and beautiful and so well made, and made primarily for English-speaking audiences. And they're published in other languages too, but they're not things that most people in India can afford. And that also makes me think a lot. So I'm just giving you like a background context for this presentation today. So let me begin now reading the paper, and please take notes. I would love for you to ask all the questions you want, and I will make sure I leave space. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then I'm going to stop, and then we'll continue with the discussion. And if we go over the time that's allotted to us, I'm happy to stay. I don't have anywhere to go to, besides being with you and engaging in a conversation. So trees are primordial. Trees take birth and rebirth. Trees make song possible. Trees are the creation of Shankar Bhagwan and are a part of him. Trees give life and friendship to humans and animals so they too can live and thrive. Trees think and live. The Pardhans that's sort of a poetic introduction. That's my writing, but it's a kind of meditation on these books and these paintings that I've been looking at for so many years. So I want to now start the paper. The Pardhans of Central India have had complex ways of relating to trees and other forest creatures as their non-human neighbors and even family members. This reflects in the visual art Pardhan artists make. Their art is known widely as quote unquote Gond art, a problematic term. Pardhans historically were the musicians and genealogists for their Gond brethren, and the idea of Gond art developed after the Pardhan artist Jangar Singh Sham, who lived from 1961 to 2001, created a specific individual language for himself that he then taught to fellow Pardhans. This presentation seeks to articulate some questions that their art raises about whether the relationship between the Pardhan and the non-human, while celebrated in the art, continues outside the frame of the painting into the settings in which their art lives and is displayed and received, including in museums, airports, corporations, and private residences. Bajju Sham's Snakes and the Earth, which is this image that you see here from the book, The Nightlife of Trees, published in 2006 by Tara Books, is accompanied by this narrative. The earth is held in the coils of the snake goddess, and the roots of the trees coil around the earth too, holding it in place. If you want to depict the earth too, holding it in place, if you want to depict the earth, you can show it in the form of a snake. It is the same thing. Shyam has nested the earth in the snake's coiling body and the tree's serpentine roots spread to make a beautiful image of creation as an environment of mutual nurture. Durga Bai and Subhash Vyayam's, I'm just showing you two more images from the same book. This is Durga Bai's beautiful painting of the Dumar tree, which is the fig tree. And then this is the Ram Singh Urbeti's The Marriage of Desire Intoxication, Mahua, and one other Bhang, I think, when they marry, what happens, right? So here is the next image that I'm going to talk about. Durga Bai and Subhash Vyayam's Shadi artist books talk about the courtship and wedding customs of urbanized and rural Pardhans. This was made for the Devi art exhibition that I curated. So this is a kind of a self-ethnography of how of marriage customs among the Pardhans these days. Talk about courtship and wedding customs of urbanized and rural Pardhans. In the 9 folios of Naya Shadi, which is what they called it, they depict the rural rituals of city Pardhans as one based on the exchange of images, the use of technology. So this middle image where you might be seeing my arrow is where it's a cell phone sending images to each other. Personal contact between the boy and the girl, arranged romance, family meetings, the wedding procession, and the post-nuptial happily ever after, which is the motorcycle scene at the bottom. The pages that you see on the right side are actually the narrative, and these were written by their daughter to accompany each of these images and tell us what they're about. It is primarily an encounter, the Naya Shadi, between 2 nuclear families who join their offspring in matrimony. The only foliage is the grassy background behind a bench where the bride and the groom romance each other, and in the wedding procession, where the memory of the village is made a part of the urban experience in the way the houses are pictured with the winding tree that separates them, and the way the women who greet the arrival of the wedding bus are dressed in saris without blouses. In contrast, each of the Purana Shadi's 47 folios, so you can understand how much more elaborate the old ways of doing the Shadi was, are filled with village and forest life in which trees, animals, and human beings relate to each other as important participants in wedding rituals. Looking at these folios, it appears that the most important ritual for reproducing Pardhan society, the marriage ceremony, requires all forms of life, but especially the arboreal, the trees, to contribute to the making of the union. The rituals are numerous, as are the familial and the social relationships and the economic transactions that require mediation through trees. So here's the cutting the Dumar tree, the tree that was painted by Durga Bai, and using it. And then here is using it to make this canopy. I'm sorry, the images are a little bit fuzzy, but I don't have a great connection, and I reduced the image sizes wherever possible. Okay, so the Shadi books also offer the beginnings of an ethnography. So what these, let me go back a second. What these lyrical images give us is an imagining of earthly life in which the human, the non-human, the human, and the divine intertwine in relationships of affect, sustenance, and shared authority. Within the paintings, we can see Pardhan artistic creativity, pre-colonial, colonial, and decolonial, as fully intersected by the politics of gender, caste, class, vernacular art, rural urbanization. So this is what they're talking about when we talk about rural urbanization. It's a term. We actually have now a national commission for rural urbanization where the government is on a mission to promote what was already happening through the market of turning rural India and its kasbas into fully urban and urbanizing spaces. So let me repeat this again. Within the paintings, we can see Pardhan artistic creativity, pre-colonial. So some of these stories are very old. Colonial, they were often consolidated in colonial anthropology. And decolonial, maybe an attempt like mine, I don't know, I'm thinking with you. As fully intersected by the politics of gender, caste, class, vernacular art, rural urbanization, and interspecies hierarchies. The Pardhan artist's visual rhetoric here is not pastoral. So it is not pastoral. It's not a cute image of a shepherd standing on a hill looking out onto the landscape and knowing how beautiful the sheep look and how time since eternity has been like this. And we all also recognize that the humble shepherd is giving us some important truths. That's not what's going on here. This is really a very complex and critical examination of something that's very central to Pardhan life. The Shadi books also offer the beginnings of an ethnography, which oscillates between the emic and the etic, something for about insiders and something for the outsiders. These are anthropological terms, thus mirroring the transformation of Pardhan life and storytelling. While every Pardhan's life has changed, it is only in the last 40 years, when led by the late Jangar Singh Sham, that a few have become visual artists who turn oral narratives into painted ones. Pardhan life is complex as well as part of the politics of the present. Its formation and transformation in folk memory and in recorded history has imbued all aspects of their past, present, and the future with many meanings, and this is in quotations, which have, again I'm quoting, changed in themselves and in relation to others. So the past and the future have all aspects, the past, present, future, all aspects of it have many meanings. This is Raymond Williams I'm quoting, which have changed in themselves and in relationship to others, as cultural theorist and novelist Raymond Williams once wrote about the country and the city. To see Pardhan artists as makers of idyllic scenes, of forest life, of life in the forest, is to misunderstand this experience. Pardhans came to paint because of the momentous changes that occurred over 400 years ago, since the time when the Marathas entered the region and began to settle there. Gonds, the patrons of Pardhans, the larger and more elite tribe, which my friend, new friend here in Hyderabad, Anant Mariganti, has reminded that very few tribal communities have this kind of mobility. And this mobility itself is a sign of their relatively higher status. Gonds, historically and politically powerful with their kings and politics, were pressed into becoming the political allies of the Marathas, or they had to retreat further into the forest. This process was altered and intensified by the British, who bureaucratically administered the land using written laws rather than established custom. The people, the animals, and the trees who had the longest, most embedded and intricate relationship to the jungle were positioned as quote unquote primitive and were disenfranchised or developed, often simultaneously. Anglican missionaries proselytized and Gonds converted to Christianity. Not everyone, but some of them, even as their way of life rapidly transformed and they were being quote unquote tribalized. The consequences of these historical experiences were borne also by the Pardhans, who received patronage from the Gonds. To emphasize Pardhan-Gond interconnectedness, the anthropologist Shamarao Hivale, who worked with Verrier Elwin, wrote in 1946 and quoted this proverb. This is a Gond Pardhan proverb. We are Gonds and Pardhans, or Patharis, as they often are called them. And when we die and rot, we are hung up together in one fish basket. That tells you that they're different, but they also understand that there's some shared destiny that they will face together because they're dependent on each other. The Pardhans were the charans, or the song people for the Gonds, who narrated Gond history. Hivale also narrates how a Pardhan informant interpreted the changes in the relationship between the Pardhans and the Gonds. Here I'm quoting Hivale. In the old days, there were only Gonds and Pardhans in this part of the country. Little land was cultivated, but the harvests were good, and the few people there could easily make a livelihood. There was so much grass for the cattle that even the wild deer would come and feed near the villages without anyone troubling them. Our difficulties began when the Hindus and the Muslims came into the Gond villages and took the fruit of the harvest. The Pardhans, who were entirely dependent on the Gonds, were unable to get support, and the only thing to do was to steal. Then came the Great Famine, and the Pardhans could not even find anything to steal and had to go to the relief works. So the relief works is like the Narega of an earlier ancestry of the Narega program that you see everywhere across India. The relief works that Hivale's informant spoke about became part of the context from which Jangar Singh Sham, Pardhan painters, and Gond art emerged. Art historical literature tells us that when J. Swaminathan began his work in Bhopal, he sent teams across the state to find artists. So I'm just going to show you a quick picture of this. I will come back to this. So this is Swaminathan, Jangar Singh Sham, and Jangar Singh Sham's wife. And on the right side, you will see that this is the murals that Jangar eventually painted at the Vidhan Sabha in Bhopal. So his life really was intersected with Swaminathan's own radical interest in being a radical modern artist, right? Who wanted to make connections with other kinds of art making, especially in tribal communities. So let me go back to this. Okay. He sent teams across the state to find artists. The team reached Patangad, which was the village that Sham was from, and found Sham's mural of Hanuman before they found him. He had gone to do relief works duty. That's the narrative that is passed down to us. It has all the elements of a classic narrative of discovery. The generation of artists who learned to paint with Jangar Singh Sham, like Baju Sham, like Durga Bai Vyayam, like Ram Singh Urviti, today live primarily in the city, and that's often in Bhopal. And they also travel across the world and across metropolitan cities in India. They make images in modern media that are themed around myths of the village and the forest. They also make art which comments on city life. For example, the very famous London Jungle Book made by Baju Sham, imbuing it in turns with romance, wonder, and sharp wit, an inheritance they have received from their bardic background, as well as from Sham himself. Their work, especially when the themes are developed from Pardhan mythology, is viewed and bought by urban audiences and collectors who see it as quote unquote contemporary tribal art, indeed as quote unquote Gond art, taking pleasure in what appears like an oxymoronic category, as tribal tradition in transition, and or as pastoral images of a world that still feels like it was or is still adjacent to, but different from their own. Who is that they? Those are urban audiences who are watching these works, who are viewing these works or buying them. When standing in displays of Gond art, observing and participating in conversations with other viewers, it is possible to see that Pardhan artists have opened up the restrictive habitus of the urban viewer to the wide ranges of central India. Sometimes though, for example, I haven't put an image of this, when Venkat Singh Sham's drawing, when he did the Smoking Taj, beautiful drawing that he did to talk about the attack on the Taj Hotel in Bombay, about the terrorist attack on the Taj Hotel in Bombay, viewer reactions are more ambivalent, praising the artist while worrying about how their tradition, that's in quotes, is being spoiled by the contemporary. There's a lot of anxiety here, and I'm recording that anxiety in this presentation for us to consider together. Now I'm moving to the next section, the artist, the painting, and the museum. Till now, the emergence of Gond art has been understood largely by art historians as part of India's artistic modernity where ideas such as the contemporary, the regional, and the folk were consolidated in service of the national and the regional. So for a state, the state of Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, for example, get a lot of mileage out of claiming Gond art as regional art. This happened when institutions were made that could incubate and reproduce and present these ideas for the creation of what was ultimately an upper class and caste cultural discourse. So if I'm just going backwards, sorry about that. So there was Bharat Bhavan, and then this is, of course, in relation to the making of Bharat Bhavan and the Vidhan Sabha, but also the making of the Manav Sangrahalaya also in Bhopal, very close by to Bharat Bhavan. And I'm coming back to this because this is the place I want to spend more time in. Ultimately, an upper class and caste cultural discourse. The making of art by vernacular artists in modern media and formats was considered to be a way of acknowledging and reinforcing the idea of the, quote, simultaneous validity of coexisting cultures, unquote. As J. Swaminathan, the artist and founder curator of Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal, established in 1982, wrote in his book Perceiving Fingers, which was published in 1987, that this new art was made or installed in a way that was most legible to urban trained Anglophone artists and audiences is something that Swaminathan did not consider. In this modernist art world, vernacular artists, including those who are identified with the specific folk culture or quote unquote tribal community, came to produce art in new ways. This newness allowed Swaminathan to argue for the contemporaneity of Anglophone and vernacular. That's my word. He called it tribal art, especially when it was fashioned in progressive institutions such as Bharat Bhavan. In this environment, the fiercely creative Jangar Singh Sham found a way to make art as he grappled with urbanization, the developmentalist, decolonizing maybe, or post-colonial state, the market economy of art, and Swaminathan, the radical artist who created the conditions in which for the first time, Gond painting emerged and came to be received as tribal and contemporary art. The Bharat Bhavan, headed for many years by Swaminathan, was established in the context of a more than a decade-long worldwide questioning of the museum. The UNESCO International Council of Museums Roundtable was held at Santiago de Chile in 1972. In its declaration, the contemporary problems of the museum in Latin America were enumerated. It is the way this document imagines the problem of the rural and the urban museum that is particularly relevant for this essay. That document pointed to the cleaving of nations into the rural and the urban, in which the former took the latter as a means to escape its problems and the consequent emergence of rural urban populations whose needs stand between these two regions. The importance of the Santiago Roundtable for Indian Museology is recounted by R.C. Sharma, the former Director General of the National Museum, in a 1998 essay. By this time, so I want you to understand that this thing is not something that exists just in Madhya Pradesh or in this presentation. It was all over the world. By this time, the integral museum that the Roundtable proposed as the solution had come to India as the eco-museum, and the discipline of the new museology had been embraced. So the eco-museum itself is a concept that comes from France, and I can answer that question later. So for example, this is a product of that eco-museum moment. This is the Indira Gandhi Manav Sangrahalaya in Bhopal. The Indira Gandhi Manav Sangrahalaya began in 1975, but really established in 1985 at Bhopal is a direct result of this. The museum's website echoes Swaminathan, with phrases such as simultaneous validity, and valorizes the curator as a facilitator for knowledge production rather than an authoritarian figure. On the IGRMS campus, however, the situation is more problematic. The miniaturized dioramas of colonial anthropology museums, which represented the lives of natives as static and timeless and thus less advanced, or once thriving but now dead, have been transformed here into life-size tableaux vivants, which is a French word to say a living picture. This is not life, it's living picture. Tableaux vivants in which members of selected communities build traditional houses and live in them. If colonial anthropology museum froze native people in vitrines and thus dissimulated, lied to us about the profound changes that colonization was making, the IGRMS displays represent tribal and folk life in its displays to freeze the idea of manav, quote, or human, to represent certain kinds of people living certain kinds of life, ignoring the basic fact that no group in India has escaped the effects of colonization, industrialization, or incorporation into the nation state. In 2013, 13 years after the state of Chhattisgarh, after the state of Madhya Pradesh was bifurcated and Chhattisgarh was formed as a separate state, and after 5 years of continuous BJP rule, the Madhya Pradesh Tribal Museum was founded. The About the Museum section in the MPTM website offers an extended discourse on its existence. I'll read you some of it. It's a direct quotation. It's in Hindi and it's in English, and it kind of reads the same in both languages. Tribal Museum, and it has its own kind of syntax, so I'm not going to correct it. Tribal Museum attempts to comprehend and express inner consciousness of tribal life in its totality. There is no major difference between inert and animate elements in tribals, or for that matter, Indian folk life. All are possessed and animated by one power, and that is why hills, valleys, rivers, rivulets, trees, and grass are all sacred. For creating above-mentioned feelings on the alien and artificial space of the gallery, somehow a climate and a background was created which can give a compound feeling of sunlight coming down through thick foliage, ruggedness of jungle and its sounds. The attempt was to arrive at the abstract element of tribal mythical consciousness and aesthetics so that these galleries were developed keeping these facts in view. Methods adopted in the galleries for capturing essence of tribal inner visions and aesthetics may seem to be artificial due to their being innovative, but in fact, they're born out of the anxiety of getting rid of artificiality. The quest to capture tribal life in a modern building is itself paradoxical, the website tells us. If we really wish to know their lifestyle and thinking pattern, we'll have to go amongst them and amidst their environment. Apparently, tribal people don't live in cities, and we can't go see their life there. In fact, many tribal people live in cities, especially in Bhopal. But as what has been said earlier, the website tells us, museums' responsibility and objective is to lay a ground for mutual dialogue between both tribal and urban societies. Therefore, on one hand, naturally occurring things like straw, leaves, stones, clay, bamboo, wood, iron, dry twigs are optimally used in galleries, and on the other hand, modern tools, techniques, audiovisual medium, lights, etc., are also used. Now I go back to myself so that I'm making that very clear that that quotation from the website ends. My presentation will also end shortly. Designed by Harchandan Singh Bhatti, a Bhopal artist, and made by members of the state's various tribes who are not cited as artists here. The MPTM, that's the short acronym for the museum, presents its narrative on tribal life as year one. That's a term that Guy Debord used in his spectacular book, The Society of the Spectacle. As year one of the encounter between the forest and hill communities and urban people, ignoring the fact that literally around the corner of the hill are two earlier museums, the two museums I've just showed you, Bharat Bhavan and Manav Sangrahalaya, that stage this very same encounter. The museum scenography is part theme park and part installation art, and is premised on a compact which renders tribal people complicit in the spectacularization of their life world. When standing in the display, the critical viewer, I'm that critical viewer. This is the question I asked. I asked, Is this what happens when the fantastic imagery, mythography, and the success of contemporary vernacular artists is instrumentalized by the state? I go back to my own exhibition and feel really very uncomfortable. More recently, another scenography project has been inaugurated. So this is, just to draw that parallel, this is a display from that museum. And these, on the left side, are two works done by Bhuri Bai for the exhibition, which I curated in 2010-11 at the Devi Art Foundation. So you can see how things are working. You know, I'm showing this to help you, to share with you my own deeply ambivalent and sometimes fearful responses to the things that happen when you put stuff out into the world. So more recently, another scenography project has been inaugurated by Rajiv Sethi, this time at the Ahmedabad residence of the industrialist Gautam and his wife Preeti Adani. Adani is the head of Adani Power Limited, which has purchased through its wholly owned Australian subsidiary, Adani Mining, Carmichael Coal and Abbott Point Port in Queensland, Australia. Excuse me, I have to drink some water. Queensland, Australia, for mining, coal, and shipping. Widely criticized for the damaging impact the mining will have on the Great Barrier Reef, as well as on the area's groundwater, as well as democratic institutions in Australia, the project has also been challenged by the Wangan and the Jaganlingu people, Australian Aboriginal people, who have said it destroys ancestral lands and totemic animals. Adani Mining won the case in its favor in June 2019. Sethi and his team have designed a large sculpture which is painted by a duo of Pardhan and Australian Aboriginal artists. It symbolizes the union of two capital formations, the Australian state and the Indian multinational corporation, and cements their shared goals to extract resources from Aboriginal land. That's my rating of it. The cynicism of joining two art forms, both ascendant in their respective countries as indigenous or contemporary. Aboriginal art is called contemporary art in Australia. It's called indigenous art in our country, but made by a community of artists who are still relatively marginalized in their respective art worlds, as well as in the nation state. On an object made under the stewardship of a famous and politically connected urban scenographer for the private residence of the Adani business house, now seems standard practice in a society where one of art's tasks is to ameliorate the damage done by capitalism. It is time to question how two art forms have come to represent the life worlds of vast populations of people who have been the first victims of industrialized mining, even in the colonial era, and who have also contested the environmental, economic, and cultural violence. So this is in Chhattisgarh, and these are women protesting coal mining and the damages caused by that. Violence that it brings in order to stage this pernicious aesthetics of mending after a rancorous and widely publicized court case. Concluding the paper, the presentation, I come to my final section, connecting the questions. Beginning with images of the nightlife of trees in the Shadi books, I've sought to make several points about the ecology of Gond art by talking about the stories and the visuals, the emergence of Gond art as a contemporary art form, the shift in the patronage structure in which Pardhans tell their stories, and the institutions which represent them. If Gond patrons turn to Pardhans to tell them stories of their ancestors, perform rituals and entertain them, readers of the books and collectors of Gond art have no ancestral or ritual connection to the stories. How might we think about this transformation in relation to the spectatorship of Gond art? The status of these stories within and without the Gond community and the Pardhan community, and how the forest in the book relates to the forests of central India. These questions are urgent as prices of art made by Pardhan artists are going up, and as they take on commissions which relocate their stories and art into new political frames. The books give us a sense of how Pardhan artists see or remember the interconnections and hierarchies in the forest and the village through their stories. The prevailing aesthetic of the images and the narrative is wonder. Through these publications, the artists seek to practice their artistry, earn a livelihood, communicate to people outside their linguistic, cultural, and geographic community the richness of their stories. The publisher and the viewer, the former through commissioning and the latter by reading, seek to partake of the interconnectedness in the book and perhaps become interconnected, maybe even enchanted themselves. Here, I want to insert a proviso. These books are about Pardhan Gond memories, but are not meant for them. In this situation, what does it mean for artists to paint their inherited stories for an audience that consists not of customary patrons, such as the Gonds were to the Pardhans, and the co-inhabitants of the forest, but for collectors, institutions, and consumers? Further work needs to be done to address this question. And I think this beautiful book that Tara Books has done begins to do some of this work. Another recent Tara book publication, Between Memory and Museum, seeks to offer perspectives of such vernacular artists in the form of dialogues and paintings, forms of art that were born in the discipline of anthropology and in the art museum. The book sensitively offers the perspectives of 38 practitioners, most of them gathered for a workshop at the IGRMS at the Manav Sangrahalaya in Bhopal, with the goal of creating a sustained conversation about what the museum means to these artists. The Pardhan artists in the book understand the museum's value, but also seek to remake it. They offer new visions for the institution because, as the editors note, the museum is now part of their tradition. And yet, it still does not always include their perspectives. It has offered them new horizons, but has also placed their valued objects and gods in vitrines and on floors, thus diminishing their vitality. It is a space of aspiration, perhaps also for healing, as well as a space of wounding for the artist, but not quite a space of mending. The feeling of belonging and unbelonging in the city and in the countryside, inside and outside the Anthropology Museum, is a continuous thread through this book. In a conversation with the artist Bhajju Sham, we spoke about how Gond art is doing well, even as young Pardhans are losing the corpus of stories which could be their artistic inheritance. Young Pardhan artists are inventing new narratives and themes which mostly merge them further into the narratives of urbanization and the contemporary art world. He speculated about the idea of a story bank which gathers and disseminates oral narratives whenever needed. Would knowing these narratives make a difference to the way Pardhans live and how they choose to be Adivasi or tribal? I use those words in quotation. In relation to the art market, the state, and the world? How might singing a story, holding on to the memory of kinship with a tree, or painting it on a canvas alter the way Pardhan artists theorize the politics of their art and their life, which remains connected to the village in the forest, as well as the colony in the city? Bhajju Sham did not advocate a mythic return to the life of the forest. The coming of roads changed life in Gondwana for at least 100 years or more, and now the coming of multi-lane highways will change it further. Without necessarily speaking against road expansion, he asked why this happened in a way that uprooted the trees, the very ones he and other Pardhan artists paint, which had been protected and nurtured for many years and which have borne witness as participants in human life. I take his comment to raise one more question. If collecting and viewing Gond art is a way for urban audiences to connect to the intertwining of human and non-human life that Pardhan artists depict, does their appreciation make them sensitive to the contradictions of capital and how the trees in the paintings are being uprooted in the village and in the forest? Thank you so much for paying attention and giving me your time. I'm happy to take any questions and all questions. So I'm going to go to the Q&A and see. Okay, so the first question is from Ganesh Shivaswamy, and his question is, a decade is a long time in India these days, you observed. I find that interesting. Why such an observation? Because things are changing so fast. That's why. And what was Manav Sangrahalay's vision, let's say in 1985 onwards, and what I was able to do in 2010 is so different by the time the what is happening in the art market, what is happening at the new museum, for that reason. If you want more questions, I'm happy to answer further on the same question. I'm trying to keep it to the point. Katie Ravindran, hi Katie. What was your reaction when you walked into the Manav Sangrahalaya? Well, I walked into it at different stages and I just feel sad. That's what I can say. I just feel sad. It's in very bad shape right now. Last time I went, it takes a lot of money to maintain those kinds of spaces, and it's hard to maintain them. And people find it very difficult to, the governments find it very difficult to find the motivation and the capital, the resources to maintain them. So that's what I feel. And Anana hires you to organize such wonderful exhibitions in tribal art. I don't know if I'm inspired. I think I have a lot of questions about the world we live in. And I'm an art historian, and I only have this space to ask these questions. And I'm very grateful that so many people have given me opportunities, including MAP, to keep asking such questions. It's this country which is so goddamn amazing. This country is so amazing. I'm so moved by it day in and day out. That's what makes me work on. I don't organize exhibitions on tribal art all the time. I'm organizing with my colleagues, various wonderful art historians, Olympia Bhatt, Lena Vincent, Sindhura D. Manjunath, so many of them, younger colleagues, institutions, Piramal Museum of Art, so many of them. I'm organizing exhibitions which help me and help us all think, I hope. That's what I'm trying to do. And enjoy the process of thinking and questioning. Veena Ravi Kumar. Isn't there a contradiction between the natural and the artificial construct of corporate museum? A huge gap seems to be there. You've mentioned it to yourself. Yeah, I mean, there's a big contradiction between the forest and the museum, any kind of museum, right? But the museum is in a bad place because it's a contradiction. Sometimes contradictions, very often contradictions are really useful things. There's no place, I would argue, that the contradiction doesn't exist. But contradictions are very useful for talking about things, and artists are very, we all should be inordinately grateful to all kinds of artists because they're so brave in a country that has so little infrastructure, so few art history programs, so few dynamic so few museums which have very dynamic programs. Artists are doing all the labor, the primary labor of questioning. And what people like me do by and large is to aid that kind of questioning. And that kind of engagement with contradiction. Oh, Dr. Heiler, thank you so much for joining us today and for your wonderful comment. And you were very kind. You're very, very kind. And I feel shy about saying what you have to say, so somebody else will say that. Vijay Sagar S. It's in a Marg magazine. It's called Art and Ecology. If you go on the Marg magazine, Marg Foundation website, you will find it there. You can get a PDF for relatively cheap. You can buy a whole magazine itself. Kavita section for books is warm, but in both curating and publishing, we see expropriation and activism, or do you see one kind of form necessarily less generous than the other? No, I don't. I started with the books, to begin softly. But I think both have problematic spaces. And I say that these books are not meant for Pradhan Gonds themselves, or even many non-Pradhan Gonds who would probably enjoy these stories very much. They're so exquisitely made and so beautifully made. But I think that the capital intensiveness and the sheer spectacular quality of the artwork and the museum and the display is just on a whole other scale. So I have to, and also books get made, and then that book, one sense, not in all senses, but in one sense. I'm just gonna wait, my connection is a little unstable. Okay, in one sense. So no, I totally agree with you. Thank you so much for that wonderful, for giving me an opportunity to clarify and offer my agreement with you. The scale of appropriation and activism is different. Susan Bean. Thank you, my dear friend Susan Bean, for joining us today, all the way from the US. Sometimes I think there are two categories of art in India: elite art and subaltern art. What do you think? Your talk was great considering the complexities of such an interplay. I'm not sure. There is elite art and there are other kinds of art. So I'm not very comfortable with binaries, as you know, Susan. And the whole presentation today, when I used a word like vernacular, was an attempt to break that binary. Because vernacular could be a range of different things. So for example, Jangar Singh Sham not only painted stories from his community, but stories about Gonds or Gond stories. But he also, a lot of his painting was done using new materials, paper, color. He learned a lot of techniques from printmaking workshops, things about Aboriginal Australian artists. So I don't know if he ever thought of himself as a subaltern. And my friend Baju Sham never seems to think of himself as a subaltern. What they do say is that, and what I also agree with, is that what Baju Sham says and other artists in this various communities which are not Anglophone artists say is, sometimes they don't want to participate in the Anglophone world because their business is really good. Like if you're making temple murals, you get damn good patronage. Why do you need to be in an art gallery and give 33% commission and whatnot, right? So, or if they're making tourist bronzes, there's a pretty good business in that, and they don't have to put the same effort. But sometimes if you are aspirational and you want to transition into a new kind of space, it's challenging. It's challenging. As Dr. Jain once said, somebody asked Jangar Singh Sham to take a picture with his shirt off. And he told that story to Dr. Jain. But that's a very crude, the crudest way of making somebody perform subalternity. But I think what's worse, I think, is, or what's even more challenging and difficult, is that we have such narrow ideas of creativity, right? We have such narrow ideas of creativity and what constitutes authorship, what constitutes critique, that anything that doesn't fit a certain formula that only has a limited shelf life does not count as contemporary art that's capable of speaking really important things to all of us. I hope this addresses your question, Susan, and I'm very happy for you to push me further. Pixel to XL. Thank you, Pixel to XL, for your question. You said, he would like to hear me suggest how things could be done differently and sustainably. I I think we have to actually we have to have more PhDs. We have to have PhD programs, art history programs, which take all these art forms as fully historical forms, which need teaching, which need syllabi, which need training, which need critique, which need our labor, curatorial and art historical labor, museological labor. We need to develop new ways of thinking about copyright and copyleft and family-based authorship. And we need to create new kinds of spaces to talk about art. And sometimes I have a question, why do we need to have so much art? And that's probably a heretical question to ask, but why do we need so much art? Pardhans didn't sing all day long. They sang when they felt like it, and they sang on occasions, but the stories were around in their heads and in their lives all day long. So I don't know, Pixel 2XL, if I've answered your question, but these are my feelings, these are my thoughts, and I appreciate you telling me. I don't see any more questions. I'm happy to stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annapurna. That was a very thought-provoking presentation, and you've given us, I think, a lot to digest. For the audience, thank you all for tuning in and for all of your questions and engagement throughout. As I've said at the start, this talk has been presented as part of the programming around MAP's exhibition on Bhuri Bai, and you can find the link for that in the chat box as well, and we hope you'll go and have a look. I think some of the questions that Annapurna has raised today were also questions that the curators of the show found themselves struggling with through the process. So thank you once again, Annapurna, for taking the time out to do this with us today. It has been very, very exciting to have you on board and to have you be part of the MAP platform. And we hope that once the museum is up and running, you'll pay us a visit and we can do something in the future.
Thank you so much for your kindness and for all the wonderful organization. I will excuse myself. And thank you again to all our audience for being with me for the entire length of this paper and presentation and question and answer session.
Indeed. Thank you, Atul. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.
Bye.